Okay, so some people think that it's very revealing that many of these cities are fortified, and that might explain why people are going to the cities. Maybe it is due to warfare between the cities, and as we're going to see with the early dynastic, there's increasing warfare and competition between these cities. So is it due to warfare or because of the fear of warfare? Or could it be something else? Could it be nomadic peoples living in the countryside that maybe farmers were trading with, but also potentially having conflict with? Was there economic attraction? Were elites within the cities forcing people to move so that they could control them better? Maybe it was a combination of all of these. But certainly, warfare and competition probably had a large part to play. But with more people living in the cities, it meant that there was more possibilities to create wealth, a more complex economy in the cities itself, more potential for taxation, more labor. And it ended up having that there was more or larger differences in wealth between people. Okay, and then there's an increase in the population we see as well. So this is hard to estimate from the archaeology, but it's based on how many sites were found during a specific time period and the size of the sites. So these numbers can change with better information in the future. But they think that that the early dynastic there was an increase from 500,000 to 1,000,000 people. Right? And again, this hyper-urbanism. By the end of the early dynastic, 78% of the people were living in cities. May reflect the fact that people didn't feel safe outside of the city walls. Okay, we know a little bit about Mesopotamian cities from the archaeology. Obviously, these cities are large and only portions can be excavated. But what we have seen, and we'll see, this is from a slightly later time period, just after the early dynastic, from a city called Ur. But it gives us an idea of what life was like in an ancient Mesopotamian cities. But they were dense, crowded. In some cities, you do have evidence of public sanitation, but again, not every house has been excavated underneath to see if it has a sewer drain or not. Usually in the center, there's the high status area with temples and things like that. Some of them had latrines and drains. Deceased people were buried underneath the floors of homes, right? So, if a relative died, you would typically bury them underneath the floor of your house or their house. Those things might be used for multiple generations. Blocks were separated by streets and alleyways. A lot of the alleyways were kind of, crowded. Some avenues were larger and some were more crowded. You had arches of mud brick over doorways. Here you can see within this city, you have kind of a concentration of a neighborhood, a temple, and a palace, right? Very close to each other. So it's not like the leaders and the people were not rubbing shoulders with each other at all. They were living in pretty close proximity to each other. Okay, when you look at population settlement, you can also see some important changes. In the Ubaid period, right, we can see very low population. We see at Eridu, growing population. Then the Uruk period, we see an increase. The beginning of the Uruk period, we saw by the late Uruk period, there's a shift south and less of the smaller sites, and the city of Uruk becomes much larger, and that trend continues, but with other cities becoming more powerful. Right. So in the early dynastic, you can see, and what you should know this also. When you look at the map here, you can see that these settlements are sort of spread out, right? They start to become more concentrated in the Uruk, and some of these other larger sites start taking off. But if you look at the distribution of the sites in the early dynastic, the distribution, you can see, is very different, right? So one thing you'll notice is that, again, the cities are getting larger. You have multiple large cities. You can see that very clearly here. But what about the placement of these cities? Are they evenly spaced out? No. They're actually, in many respects, along a line, right? And those lines are canals and the rivers. This is when the river Tigris and Euphrates levels start to drop. And as a result, people have to live right on the river. And irrigation, large-scale irrigation, becomes much more of a necessity. And people really start to settle in these cities, start to build large irrigation systems. And in some cases, as we're going to see, these systems abut each other, or the territories overlap. And you could see some of the problems that might emerge from that. Then in the later period, which we're going to look at, I think maybe next week or the week after, we start to see more people moving into the countryside. So sort of reversing that process. Okay, so the water levels drop. Large-scale irrigation becomes more important. And so, for example, what you see northeast of Uruk at the Jemdet Nasser period, right? And then at the end of the Jemdet Nasser period, you see that these sites are abandoned and they're really living along one irrigation system. So people are organizing canal systems. These canals are going straight off of portions of the Euphrates and then feeder channels from that to feed their fields. At this point, as we'll talk about later, salinization is not a problem yet, but it does become a problem later on. Salinization occurs in very hot climates because what happens is that irrigation water in the soils evaporates, leaving behind minerals and salts in the soil, which sometimes makes the soil completely unusable. In the early dynastic, though, this is not a problem yet. So they're beginning to irrigate. As we'll see, they're also using a fallow system as well. So all of these major cities are along canals and tributaries of the Tigris and Euphrates, especially the Euphrates system. Right? And you can see all in a line. Okay, well, let's take a little look at the temples now. And we're going to look at a couple of temples from Sumerian cities and what we know about how the temples actually functioned. All right, let's see what archaeology has to tell us about temples in the early dynastic, in the Sumerian civilization. Well, each of these cities has several temples, but there might be one temple for the patron god of that city. As we're going to see, these temples are institutions. They usually are cordoned off from other areas by a wall, and there are activities that are going on inside of the temple areas that are not only related to religious worship. In the center of every temple, and the temples, again, are, as we'll talk about several times, they're not public places. The temple buildings themselves, they're only for priests and priestesses to attend the needs of the gods or goddesses, represented by the images of those gods and goddesses. So offerings of food and drink and other things to basically keep the gods satisfied and happy, and to look favorably down on the people in that city. Okay, the religion wasn't congregational, right? That is, people didn't go to the temple and hear a sermon like you might do today at a synagogue, a mosque, church. Right? People didn't necessarily gather in large groups to worship. They also didn't even really expect to get spiritual guidance from the temple. And religious leaders didn't preach to people. People worshipped their own gods privately in their houses, or as we'll see where there's evidence of small neighborhood shrines. So you might have an important god to, let's say, your kin group. And each individual might believe that they have a personal god or goddess who is watching over them. Mesopotamians did not go to the big city temples to pray, right? The temples were houses of the god or the goddess, where the deity actually lived. That's where the statue was. None of these statues or images of gods have ever been found archaeologically, probably because they were decorated with precious materials. And those are the first things to be melted down if an invading army comes and sacks a city. Right? So again, it's the house of a god, like the Egal, the great house, is a house of a king. They think of many things in terms of households. So this is off limits except to people who work in the temple, the priests and the priestesses. And so household is a good way to think about the temples and also the palaces at this time. And using the idea of household from Max Weber, who is a famous sociologist, he coined the term oikos from ancient Greek houses during classical Greece. And the Oikos economy is different from the tribute economy. Right? So in Uruk, we thought we had kind of like a tribute economy where people are creating surplus food and they're giving that surplus food to the temple, right? Almost like taxes. The oikos is kind of a self-sufficient household that is satisfying the needs of the household. So rather than the temple taxing people in the city, they have their own land, their own craft specialists, and their own wealthy families that are part of the temple system. Right? And so their economic foundation is based on what they actually own. As we'll see, they don't own all the land, of the city, but they own a portion of the land. And they have their own specialists who create trade goods to trade for precious items. And they have craftspeople to make other things. And so they essentially are, in some ways, self-sufficient. This would be like, instead of Congress and the White House calling up for taxes to pay for all sorts of things, like the military, for example, instead the White House and Congress own businesses. There were government-owned businesses or things like that, or they own government. There's government-owned agricultural land, and from that, their wealth base was generated. So it's different from a tribute system, and this oikos system, as termed by Max Weber, is used in many different scenarios. So you might actually see it if you take a political science or sociology or another kind of class. So it's a good way of understanding the temples at this time, because in archaeological excavations of these ancient temples, we find evidence of these different activities going on. We find agricultural activities, we find craft activities, and we find evidence of control with cylinder seals and ceilings and things like that. So the oikos economy is a good way of sort of understanding the temples at this time. The temples are not just ideological powerhouses and houses of the gods, they're also economic powerhouses, right? They again have their own sort of wealth. They're making crafts, they're making bread, they're making beer, textiles, things like that. So one particular important excavation, this was done by the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, and you can see many of these things at the University of Chicago in their museum. The city of Kafaja is its modern name. It's ancient Tutub. Nearby, as we'll talk about, is another city, modern name Asmar, ancient name Eshnuna. Tutub was actually part of Eshnuna. But you can see this really large temple oval complex surrounded by a wall near these residences over here in the heart of the city. you can see these really, really thick major walls. These are only the foundations. The rest is not there, but you can see how wide they are at the base. We're going to talk about the different kinds of architecture at this time, but one of the key features of early dynastic brickwork is the use of what are known as Plano convex bricks. What does that mean? It means that they're flat on one side and curved on another side. Plano convex. So they look a little bit like loaves of bread, and they're used to create herringbone patterns and things like that in the walls. So they're kind of decorative. And, anytime an archaeologist finds a wall with this kind of Plano convex architecture, they know it's early dynastic because we don't find it before and we really don't find it after. Okay, so this is what the ancient temple area, the temple oval, as it's called, in Kafaja, looks like, with the main, again, temple building, which is where the image of the god would have been kept. And again, this was off limits. This was only for the priests and priestesses. This is where some of the religious functions would occur. These were probably crafts areas and other areas that were producing goods. And this was kind of a more public access area. But you can see that access to the temple was tightly controlled. One wall, one major doorway, another major doorway in order to get into the temple area itself. So access was strictly controlled in this temple, as we see in most temples in Mesopotamia. So at Kafaja, workers were paid in barley and also vegetable oil and wool, and that was enough to support themselves and also their family. They would bring the barley home, they would make bread and also beer, they would use the wool to make clothes, rugs, blankets, things like that. The vegetable oil would be used for eating, but also be used for light. This is how lamps were lit before candles. And if the workers had rations left over, they could use that to trade for other things they needed, like salt, tools, and other things, right? So it was an economic area as well as a religious area. And different crafts were segregated in different parts of the temple precinct. So you had textile production going on in one area, spinning and sewing going on in another area, production of metalwork, scribes recording what is going on. Textiles is one of the most important exports in Mesopotamia throughout its history, because again, there's not much else to make based on the resources that exist in Mesopotamia. And women become some of the main, well, they were in the Uruk period as well. We have evidence of that. But there's text evidence from cuneiforms, documents from this time period that shows that women are some of the main producers making textiles in the temples and also the palaces. Right? Even for thousands of years after the early dynastic period, in Roman accounts, there's references to the importance of Mesopotamian textiles. Here you can see two Iraqi individuals. You can see spinning. They use a spindle whorl. This is way before the spinning wheel. So the only way you could spin wool into yarn is using this instrument here called a spindle, where you would spin this, and that would make the cords wrap around each other, and you would use raw wool in order to continue the strand of yarn and keep it going. This is very labor intensive. It would take about 6 people spinning to keep up with anyone weaving on the loom. Okay, so there might be large ceremonies that would occur at certain times of the year, and certain times of the year they might take the image of the god out of the temple and parade it around the city. But for the most part, people were not involved in what was going on at the temple. There might be a pedestal at the foot of the temple where people could give offerings to the temple. And we could see at Kafaja, the temple, and we see this at other cities too, the temples become more and more powerful and larger. Right? Okay. The walls are probably to keep people out, but also to protect all the things that are going on in there. There's a lot of wealth being created within the temple precinct. Now, there's a great similarity between the temples in different cities in Mesopotamia. They seem to be functioning in much the same way. And in fact, there might be communication between the high-level officials in the temples, because you find some interesting things. For example, this is an artifact from Kafaja, and it was probably affixed to a door, and there would have been a peg that would have fit in here. Right? Now, what you see, everything except, let me go to the next slide, everything except this piece is from Kafaja, and you can see it depicts a scene, people carrying goods and things like that. Well, it turns out that a piece from a similar door socket fits almost, not quite perfectly, but fits pretty well in this piece at Kafaja, showing that at this other city of Ur, they had really the same kind of artifact with the same identical scene on it. So the artifacts, the religious artifacts and the temple artifacts, are even kind of the same or standardized in between the temples. Now, another thing that's interesting about the Temple of Kafaja is in the earlier period, you have this major temple, but you also have these smaller temples right outside the temple oval. This is the plan, and this is what it would have looked like, these smaller temples. In the next period, these temples are demolished, and another wall is built around the main temple. Right, so what was going on? Well, what do you think might have been going on? Small temples gotten rid of, main temple continues. Some people think that maybe the main temple was consolidating their power, trying to get rid of essentially maybe rival temples right outside their walls. We're not exactly sure, but that's a good explanation. So the temples get larger through time. The famous ziggurat of Ur is actually from the period right after, well, a couple hundred years after the early dynastic, as we're going to see, but it's a good example of a Mesopotamian ziggurat. Okay, so the nearby site of Tel Asmar, also excavated by archaeologists from the Oriental Institute, also part of that same city-state, quote-unquote, right? Ancient Eshnuna, and you can see it's up here. So here's ancient Kafaja, and here's ancient Asmar. They're right next to each other. And at excavations in the temple area at Tel Asmar, and here you can see this was the director of the Oriental Institute at Chicago visiting the archaeological dig. Excavating in the temples, what they discovered right outside of the temple was a cache of statues that were found. They found at Asmar 12 of these really nifty, I think they're nifty, Mesopotamian Sumerian statues. These are, some of the earliest kind of, three-dimensional representations of people that we have. This, in terms of artistic quality, this is fairly comparable to what we see in Egypt at around the same time period during the Old Kingdom. The Egyptians might have been a little bit ahead in terms of art quality, but you'll see that the art increases in quality and sophistication in Mesopotamia over time. So what do these things represent? They're not gods. Right? You'll see that there's women. You can see here a woman in the dress with a hairstyle. There are men. Some men are bearded, and some men are clean-shaven and bald. Right? So what were they? And you can see some of them have these enormous eyes, really wide eyes. Well, these are not gods, but they're actually surrogates for important individuals to pray. Right? That is, if you're an important person, you can't pray in front of the image of the god all day. You have things to do, right? So what you do is you create a statue of yourself, and that statue is placed before the image of the god, and that statue, is praying before the image of the god. So basically, the statue is kind of embodying you, and your essence is in that statue, and it's praying to this statue in which the god or the goddess is residing or has the essence of that god or goddess. And so it can pray on your behalf, right? So here's one of those statues in front of, probably Inanna, praying for you on your behalf. And then when you passed away, and then others passed away, they would bury the statues outside the temple in kind of like a grave, like they might do with a person. And so these are really interesting kind of statues, I think. And, since we don't have statues of gods themselves, they give us a little bit of a window into what was going on in some of these ancient Mesopotamian temples, right? Again, this is the ziggurat of Ur, and we'll talk more about when we talk about the city of Ur. Right? So the temple were important religious institutions. In the Uruk period, they were pretty much, we think, kind of everything. The executive, branch, basically the government, political center, ideological center, economic center. At this point, though, it seems like the palace starts to become more of the political center, and the temples still remain very, very powerful, but they're more of the ideological, ceremonial, and also some administrative center, right? Again, these are areas dedicated to the gods. There's some courtyards for communal gatherings, but then there's also the important storehouses, the archives, the workshops, where things are created. At Kafajeh and also Asmar, especially in that oval circle at Kafajeh, they found clay sickle blades and ovens, so evidencing production of food. They found spindle whorls from those spindles, and they found loom weights from looms, showing textile production. They found jewelry, cosmetics, and statues that show display and adornment. Weapons were found, showing some use of force or ability to use force, and then also administration and transactions, seals, weights, and also cuneiform tablets. Right? So those activities that I talked about going on in the temples are evidenced by the artifacts and the archaeology. Okay, so sometimes people think of the early dynastic incorrectly as a temple state. It was not really a temple state. The temples were very, very important, but the kings and the palaces were also very important at this time, and the kings and the palaces were becoming more and more important through time in the early dynastic period. Right? Also, each city had more than one temple. Maybe one was dedicated to the main god, but there were temples to other gods as well. The temples remain ideologically supreme, so the kings and the palaces never take over that kind of ideology. The king and the palace has nothing to do with cultic practices or religion. That's the realm of the temple. So it's really sort of a differentiation between temple and palace. And the palaces become more of an executive power, and as we're going to see, more of a military power. Again, as I mentioned before, Sumerians grouped the temples, the palaces, the households, all in the category of the house, right? So the house of the god, the house of the king, the house of this kin group, etc., etc. Right? And a lot of the activities going on in the temple were going on behalf of the god or the goddess to basically support the temple and make the deity happy. A city would have a lot of different cultic buildings. So when we say cultic, we mean anything that is dealing with religion. Right? The royal family would maybe work for the temple. And so, again, it was like, as we'll see, it sort of mirrors the pantheon of Mesopotamian gods who are related to each other, just like the Norse gods, just like the Greek gods. Okay, so other pieces of evidence that show us that this is not a temple state where the temple controls everything and runs everything. There are legal documents that record the sale of land that are not owned by the temple. So obviously the temple does not own all the land, and there are people who don't work for the temple who own their own land, right? So it's a sector within the economy, but it's not the only sector. Right? We also read in temple documents about seasonal workers. That is, people who are not there all year round in the temple. This means they're doing something else at other times of the year, and they're coming probably from outside the city and surrounding villages, showing that they're being hired, essentially. They're contractors, in a sense. So, Mesopotamian cities were temple cities in the way that Detroit is the motor city, right? That is, car manufacturing is a large part of what Detroit does, even today, more so previously, obviously, right? But it's also not the only thing that's going on in Detroit. There's a lot of other things, and also the CEO of Ford is not running the city, right? We also see an impact of the palace and the temples on outside village communities, right? We start to see some corvée labor, that is calling up a people to work for the temple or work for the palace, to build irrigation canals, create new arable land, right? Things like that. And so there is a kind of an impact of the city on the villages around it, the villages that were not right next to the city. Right? It also looks like a large portion of the population were independent in their villages. Right? They gave tribute, at certain times of the year. They worked as laborers some times of the year, and they also worshipped the city gods. But the main economic base of the temple was the land that it owned and the craft producers that it had. Right. So again, sort of think of it like tithing by other people. So also within the temple, there's kind of a growing class of administrators, merchants, scribes, specialized craftsmen. Right. The temple's kind of like an industry in a sense, or what today we might call "quote unquote" job creators. There are positions associated with the temple, specialized positions. And these positions become more numerous over time. So they become very important parts of city life in Mesopotamia. Okay, now let's take a little bit look at these irrigated fields. The fields were usually canals that were built off of the Euphrates, and then long rectangles facing the canal on their shorter side, right? And then kind of these feeder channels that would feed the fields, right? So you'd have rows and rows of these, and we have an idea of what they might have looked like from the text. Now, people would not just eat barley, as we'll talk about the diet of ancient Mesopotamians. They wouldn't just eat bread and beer. They also grew their own vegetables. There were areas close to the canals that were for garlic and onions and legumes. Sumerians really loved onions, believe it or not. Date palms, things like that. Also, the fields were not cultivated all at once. They had a rotation, kind of leaving fallow. They were required to grow grains in a field one year and then leave it fallow the next year. So at this point, they understood the problem with reusing land over and over and over constantly. Okay, next thing we're going to look at is mythology, right? The gods and goddesses of the ancient Sumerians.